It's really nice to be here, so thanks to Eleanor and Kate and MIMA. It's my first time down in MIMA, so it's a real treat. It's a real treat to be engaging with the Lucie Rie exhibition and standing before you speaking. I am not a Lucie Rie expert. I guess I come, like many people, from a position of love and enthusiasm, nor am I a keeper at Paisley Museum. I'm trained as a practitioner. I studied ceramics at Glasgow. I studied ceramics at the Royal College, and I work at the Glasgow School of Art as a curator, and a maker, and so lots of sort of different perspectives on ceramics. I've written down everything I'm going to say this morning. I hope it's not going to send you all to sleep. But I'm going to talk about the Paisley Museum collection and its relevance. I guess its relevance to Lucie and my interests. Paisley Museum is currently undergoing a huge renovation, a very slow renovation, but I'll talk a little bit about that. I think I've got slides to coincide with what I'm saying, and some pictures to try and illustrate what I'm talking about. I'm also conscious, I wasn't aware of, I'm assuming everybody knows lots about Lucie Rie, even more than me, and we've just seen that incredible exhibition downstairs. So, as Eleanor says, I'm going to be talking around her a little bit, and a little bit about her as well. The only sort of the new reflection I've had from seeing that show is the buttons don't really excite me as much as other things about Lucie Rie, but seeing them down there, they just look like the most amazing comprehensive glaze test that she must have undergone, and you can see that sort of influence in the later work she did. I'll begin. So I'm a curator and practitioner. I was invited to make a selection of ceramic works for the new permanent display at Paisley Museum when the museum reopens. So this paper will present research carried out during this process and connect the selection of works made with the influence of Lucie Rie on post-war studio ceramics, discussing how the collection demonstrates a permanent rupture from the folk revival tradition, setting the course for new studio ceramics, rigorous making embedded in clay. So the museum and art galleries was gifted to Paisley by Peter Coates of Coates Threads in 1871. At the time, Turkey Red was at the height of production, and so was the Singer sewing machine factory down the road. The first curator of the museum was an entomologist, Maurice Young, who's no doubt responsible for the large collection of taxidermy. Today it houses an interesting social history collection covering the history around the Paisley area, the importance of textiles and its shawls. It's got an art collection that mostly contains work of 19th century and 20th century Scottish artists, Stephen Campbell and John Byrne, both from Paisley being most notable perhaps, which is particularly interesting when you consider along this sits an outstanding collection of ceramics, mostly from 1958 to 69 of really national significance, very similar to the Shipley collection and I believe MIMA, so I'm really looking forward to going upstairs and seeing what's there. Cyril Rock was the director from 1949 to 66. And he talked about his collecting rationale in a accompanying catalogue to a 1984 touring exhibition organised by the Scottish Arts Council. He was worthwhile to conscious that there was a different popularity of the ubiquitous 18th century ceramics in most museum collections across the UK. He found it worthwhile to explore the field of 20th century British wares, reaction against the over-elaborate factory-made pottery of the 19th century, and led to the rise of studio potteries run normally by individual craftsmen making quality items, often of simple shapes and somewhat austere styles. So that's the words of Cyril Rock. He was aware that few museums were displaying studio ceramics, and he noted it was a promising field for exploitation, especially as the prices were still quite moderate. He compiled a list of names as a nucleus for the collection, including State Murray, Leach, Cardew, Coper and Rie. The growth of this collection is due in part, quite significantly, I think, to Henry Rothschild, who was the young director of Primavera, encountered Cyril Rock. An agreement was made so he could choose for him outstanding examples of pottery that being shown through the Gallery of Primavera. So regular contact was developed and many objects acquired unseen, but as Rothschild wrote, I always make sure that the museum's got the best pieces before I chose for myself, because I felt it was most important for them to be able to show them in a wider public. Coinciding with Cyril Rock's retirement from the museum, a hiatus in collecting occurred in '69 when the management committee at the museum decided they'd acquired enough ceramics. But by '75, the mood changed and a priority was given to patch the omissions, making the collection in what they deemed was a critical time in studio ceramics, '69 to '75. In the '80s, there were two significant displays at the museum of the complete studio ceramics. And in 1984, the Scottish Arts Council organised a touring exhibition of the collection to highlight the significance of what it contains. And luckily, an inventory in the form of a basic catalogue, one of my prized possessions, quite rudimentary, still remains a sort of only thorough catalogue of the ceramics collection. and it was a comprehensive survey of the collection at the time. That catalogue states that the Scottish Arts Council recommended that this collection of national importance be used to establish a centre for the study of studio ceramics in Scotland at Paisley for groups of individuals interested in all aspects of studio ceramics. And we're really still waiting to see that study centre materialise. At the same time, the chief curator was authorised to purchase annually works to maintain the national importance of the collection, but from here the collection becomes less consistent. It broadened to seek to represent Scottish studio ceramics of the time, Alec Leckey, Dave Cohen, Bill Brown, Rosalie Cooper, for example, and stories have been told that the annual nature of the collecting meant that the curators would often turn up at local potters' doors just before the end of the tax year and basically purchase what was coming out of the kiln. So I was asked to make a selection of 20 works for the permanent display at the new museum, which is currently undergoing, in the architect's words, a radical renovation. And when you think that this catalogue includes the works of nearly 150 makers, many of which have several pots in the collection, you can see what an impossible task this has been. So my selection focuses primarily on, I suppose there's a nice picture of Lucy, I think we've seen her downstairs. So I'm going to talk through sort of only really a few of those selected works, but focusing on the outstanding works in the collection, I think sort of, a best of, and this sort of focuses around the acquisitions made by Cyril Rock and Henry Rothschild, with a few recent additions. I've peppered the display with some of the many industrial Scottish ceramics also present in the collection, I suppose as a contrast to studio wares. And the display, I hope, will speak to the knowledgeable enthusiasts as much as introduce new audiences to the possibilities of ceramics. There's a thread of narrative linking the materials to its many applied processes for making, and an undeniable link between the original nucleus of the studio collection, Leach, Cooper and Rie, with the explosion of radical studio ceramics that they inspired in the 60s and 70s and 80s, to the works of Alison Britton, Elizabeth Fritsch, Ewan Henderson and Angus Sutty, who I'd like to talk about today. So Lucie Rie's influence on 20th century studio ceramics could be explained by her employees and apprentices she trained at Albion Mews, by her teaching or through her prolific catalogue of exhibitions. She didn't impart an obvious style, she encouraged hard work to develop deep knowledge of materials and bodies and an individualistic approach to making. Many of the works in the Paisley collection demonstrate Rie's influence on a new wave of radical ceramics, imbuing an urbane tone with materiality, exemplifying the pushed boundaries of context and form. References and influence in the pots come from out with the pottery tradition, from life to which they would return once made. She became the foil for Leach in his rural reverence to the past and to the east. She allowed her European training and influence to inform her aesthetic and context. She acknowledged contemporary urban living, modern materials, industrialization. She acknowledged she made everything herself. Within her studio work lay a series of contrasts, tight control pushed to the brink, painted slips interrupting once-fired glazes on pure simple forms, functional forms and art objects for contemplation, poetry and prose. She spoke little in public about her work and wrote even less, but her philosophy on making was evident in how she lived for her work and literally with her work, her Gesamtkunstwerk. She was consistent in her approach with iterative style developments over her long career. Her level of skill, high standards of making, and impeccable work ethic allowed her artistic vision to thrive through her simple forms and modest product. In a very short credo she wrote in 1950, she states, "If one should ask me whether I believe myself to be a modern potter or a potter of tradition, I would answer, I don't know and I don't care. Art alive is always modern, no matter how old or young. Art theories have no meanings for me, beauty has. This is all my philosophy. I do not attempt to be original or different. Something which to describe I am not clever enough moves me to make what I do." But she made a profound and tacit influence on a range of makers in the latter part of the 20th century, giving them confidence to talk and write about their work, deconstruct the canon of craft pottery, rupture the rules of factory making, make and do what they desired, and this came at a time of great change. The swinging 60s, women's lib, the threat of nuclear war, Thatcher and the AIDS epidemic. Individual, cosmopolitan, modern. I'm sure we all know this about Lucie Rie. She was an autonomous maker and thinker. She had no one like her in her immediate community. This encouraged her individualism. And I quote, "Through her training as a potter in Vienna to her exile in London and her creation of a style of making that had no counterpart in the earthy functionalism of British pottery, she projected a force field of separation from the expectations of those around her. She challenges the convention of the discipline by potting, introducing a whole new aesthetic far removed from the pottery of traditional craftsmen. And she was a modernist. Lucie Rie's pots reveal an instinct for powerful concision, for the paring back of form, textures, functions to the essential. Her life reveals someone who was able to get to the point. and her post-war pots were made to be admired by the Metropolitan. And I quote Edmund Duval in a review he made of Emmanuel Cooper's book in The Guardian. Rie's London was full of architects, writers and artists, many of them from similar urban Middle European backgrounds. This meant that her pots belonged to a distinctly contemporary world where pots took their place alongside other art and within a modern lifestyle. There was no sense of pottery being a lesser art. You can see the self-confidence, this lack of grandstanding when you look at the pots she made. So I'm going to talk sort of about, I suppose, her spheres of influence, and hope this clicker is going to work. So I think it's remarkable what a strong friendship formed between Riesch and Lie in spite of themselves. Here we have Suetsu Yanagi, Bernard Leach, and Shoshi Hamada. His first response to her and her work was a snub. He said it was too thickly glazed, thinly potted, too much like stoneware with no humanity. But her response to their first encounter was of thanks. I want to thank you. You remind me that there's something else beside Hitler and refugees' problems and the need to earn money. I'd forgotten it. At a conference arranged in Dartington, Robert Melville wrote about the gatherings of such erstwhile potters like we have here, including Lucie Rie and Anne Coper and many others from that generation. He described the conference as the general effect as of an ethnographical exhibit of the remains of a lost civilization, of a village and town community of highly aesthetic peasants. The exception included Lucie Rie and Hans Coper, remained outside the prevailing atmosphere of rural quietism. That the artist craftsman is not necessarily an anachronism in our time, that it is not impossible for him or her to be, so to speak, be with us, is what he said of Lucie and Hans. So Leach can't have enjoyed reading that, but it's perhaps their distinctiveness that made them such good friends. Rie with her composed urban style, Leach with his robust country wear. Rie was driven by aesthetics, not ideals, but they were both reaching post-war audiences who wanted something new. We've got a number of Leach works in the collection, and we're going to be showing these two beautiful pots, really strong, really Leachian, with a Tamaku glaze and a really strong white pot. Rie was unapologetic to put herself into her pottery. She stamped her pots with a series of carefully considered monograms and signatures. She laboured with the underneath as much as the rims. She adapted and adopted tools, safety razor blades, for example, to help her get just the right line and depth to her pots. She made references to historic ethnographic objects, but she was not bound by any aesthetic or tradition. She did not refer to the unknown craftsman. She was Lucie Rie, liked to make pots and sell them. And in spite of all this, Leach and Rie were good friends. He made himself at home at Albion Mews and relied on Rie for personal and professional advice throughout his long career. Coming across 4 stamps issued by the Royal Mail to celebrate the centenary since his birth in 1987, I was surprised that he was commemorated alongside Rie, Hans Coper and Elizabeth Fritsch. When you read about Leach and Rie, they are more often than not put at loggerheads with each other, disciples that you needed to choose between. But their shared friendship and significant contribution to studio ceramics is closely linked. And I wonder what Leach would have thought of the stamp collection, but in 1987, perhaps they were the obvious choice to celebrate alongside Leach, contemporary makers all contributing to our understanding of the ceramic medium. And I suppose after Leach, you could say Hans Coper was the next big influence on Rie, and this relationship was certainly mutual. Although Rie was 18 years his senior, he quickly learned to pot, reportedly learning to throw in a week. And of their relationship, she said, he knew much more than I did. And he was obviously one of many men who liked to take Lie out of her kiln when she was unloading it. Most importantly, Hans Coper gave Rie an injection of confidence when she needed it. Until this point, although not necessarily lonely, she had no peer that was offering support and criticism to her practice. When she showed Hans both her Leachian and Viennese pots, he was emphatic that the latter were the better. He said they gave voice to her talent. What Coper gave Rie was a bolstered sense of cultural identity in the face of the British artistic establishment, a confidence in her own aesthetic vision. Lucie taught Hans how to make ceramics, and through this gave form to his talent as a sculptor. Coper in return gave confidence to the pots that Lucie made, evolving from the finest, most glorious tableware to objects that owned their presence in the space they occupied. A subtle change, for Rie's forms always remained domestic in scale and imbued function in their form. The collection doesn't hold that many Copers, but this object will go on display. It's not difficult to see why Coper's pots are often described as masculine to Rie's feminine style, but I think that's too simplistic analogy. Teaching at Camberwell for Rie began in '58, not long after the decade or so she and Cooper shared a studio at Alban Mews. By all accounts, she was not a natural tutor, but she was in her 50s with a growing international reputation, so gave kudos to their pottery department. Cooper joined a few years later. So I just had some quotes from students, and John Ward described her as a quiet presence appearing somewhere in the room whilst they were working. And Rie reportedly spoke to Ewan Henderson about his pots. She said, "Your pots are really a caricature of what you want to make, but one day I hope you'll get it right." And apparently this observation had a deep impression on him. She found her niche, silent and stern, but also able to impart valuable direction and advice. Make a teapot for discipline was a common mantra cited by Emmanuel Cooper, and the teapot will come to later in the work of Angus Suttie. It's really, really nice to see the Wedgwood samples downstairs, which I've only really seen in books before. So I think we've got... in an interview in New York in '54, Rie mentioned that she'd like a factory to produce her cups. I suppose so the next sphere of influence is just looking at industry. 10 years later, Wedgwood invited Rie to design those samples we can see downstairs. She made 18 cups and saucers, all different to one another, but Wedgwood didn't quite think they were right, and she was not impressed by that decision, which on reflection was a shame that we didn't see it ever happen. I think it probably pushed Rie to be working to sort of to return to the studio and be confident in the work she was making herself. She wasn't adverse to considering her work design, but I think she liked to take control of the work she was making. Edmund, again, in the article in The Guardian, talks about Rie's ceramics. He says, "Each pot is careful. Pick up a teapot and look underneath. There's the fine white line of the unglazed porcelain, the glaze stopping in a perfect controlled way, and then there is a radiating series of fine lines scratched through one glaze to another, framing below the joint seals of Lucie Rie and Hans Cooper. All this work for the base of a cup." So in the display, we don't have these lovely cups. We have got a Wedgwood, which I'm still toying with, whether it's going to sort of sit alongside the studio ceramics. And I've got this on a very slow. I'm also toying with displaying some Govan-Croft, which is a really wonderful Govan as a part of Glasgow, sort of mid-century ceramics producers that's no longer there, like the rest of them. And we do have some of Lucie Rie's modest functional ceramics as well. In '65, she was part of an exhibition, Hand and Machine, showing small runs, industrial wear, and batch production by potters working like Rie. An art critic for the Sunday Telegraph spoke about the exhibition. He says, "I believe that basically pottery must be domestic, something to be used," but he goes on to say, with a liberal interpretation of function. Through the medium of functional tableware, Rie pushed her making an aesthetic. This approach was clearly forging a new approach to pottery, in keeping with the new age of modernism, finding new forms for all articles of necessity, as Alison Britton writes. Leach was doing it just as Cooper and Rie were. The intrigue lies in the differences in what they chose to investigate and what they made out of their responses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Alison Britton, and mostly in her words, because they're so much better than mine. Alison Britton was kind of, I suppose, first and foremost a student of Cooper. His influence seen on the scale she worked, and she was also very inspired by Rie. In an essay she contributed to the life and work of Lucie Rie that was edited by Emmanuel Cooper, she writes, "There's never been a time through the decades in which I've been a potter when the work of Rie and Hans Cooper did not seem to matter, or even temporarily disappear from view. During the 1970s, they seemed so significant that they were perceived by many to forge the only alternative strand in Britain to the Bernard Leach tradition. But they're also seen as parents of the kind of ceramics that developed next, partly through their teaching role at Camberwell and the RCA. There's a number of works we're going to be putting on display, a jug and a vase, that were bought from around that time via Primavera. Alison goes on to say, "There was an affection for the city as a place to make, which sets them apart from the deep English emotive investment in craft in the country. They were both, talking of Hans and Lucie, they were both Jewish European exiles who made their homes in London, Cooper from Germany and Rie from Vienna. By looking at their work, how they showed it and who they sold it to, we can pick up a feeling of a completely different sensibility from that of the English rural craftsman. We can begin to see the start of the urban maker, someone who was at home in the contemporary world and not in flight from it." And the last thing Alison mentions is reworked for so many decades and made so many kinds of pots, we can grow old getting to know the different phases of the search. And you can really see that downstairs. There's in the last room, there's 2 bowls that look identical, but I think they're a decade apart. Those are sort of with the green and pink. But she goes sort of back and forth between her influences and revisits so many approaches and styles. And this is the second pot, which I really love. It's got that sort of strength of hand-built and drawing and painterliness that so describes Alison's works. And also Elizabeth Fritsch is who I want to talk about next. Elizabeth Fritsch exemplified the dichotomy of working women in the 1970s who demonstrated a strong drive to work and earn with dual commitments to traditional notions of marriage, homemaking and motherhood. Elizabeth encountered Rie and Cooper as a student in the RCA with peers such as Alison Britton, Carol McNichol and Jackie Poncelet. So it's really exciting to hear there's a Jackie Poncelet exhibition coming here, who's also represented in the collection. Fritsch was encouraged by Cooper to develop her own way as a result. She started to discover an individual style. She used her development of the 2.5 dimension to imbue her form with a surreal and insubstantial feeling, giving it, in a very literal sense, edge. She sought to transform the ceramic material through optical illusion to something more inert, imbibing music, space and light. Pots About Music, a 1978 watershed exhibition for Fritsch, had an accompanying catalogue that firmly lay out the intersection between her practice and making and influences including Rie. In this catalogue, Fritsch acknowledges that her work involves a rigorous approach to technical practice, technique, not as an end in itself, but as a means for achieving a kind of fluency and the freedom to act spontaneously and effortlessly, the freedom to improvise. This technical rigour mirrors that of her teachers, namely Cooper and Rie, and indeed echoes the complete dedication of making as fostered by Leach, Yanagi and Suetzo. But this rigorous making was done amongst domesticity, making music, living in a city, a more modern deflection of the effects of contemporary life. Fritsch writes in her exhibition catalogue, some machines, some industrial landscapes, some modern cities have a surreal transfigured beauty, and this is probably why I can no longer make exclusively countrified backward-looking pottery. The austere grace and sensibility of his work, Cooper, are also present in her teaching ideals, she writes. The same can be said of Lucie Rie, who has helped me overcome technical problems, as well as be an inspiration by virtue by her work and personality. She states strong, mysterious, charismatic pottery was not exclusively a thing of the past or of primitive societies, but was being made now and here, even in London. She goes on to say there's a paradox involved between real and surreal function, between kitchen and temple, between ordinary prosaic fact and an exciting poetic metaphor. All good pots belong to some extent in both worlds, whether it's a Greek drinking cup with flowers painted on it or a Lucie Rie jar with flowers drinking from it. I think I've got some more really slow slides of Elizabeth Fritsch because, as well as Lucie Rie, I could sit with her pots all day. The scale of these pots is really interesting. I think there's a really huge complexity with ceramics collections in terms of large collections, the breadth of similar shaped, sized, often coloured objects and how you give them space that Lucie Rie was so good at doing with her pots that when it's all sort of mono-material, it becomes complex. But I think these Elizabeth Fritsch pots are extraordinary. Computer be good to me. So I just want to talk about another couple of people and talk about Ewan Henderson because he really sort of exemplifies, I guess, a disciple of Lucie without being too sort of similar style. Like many of the others, Henderson found himself in the Camberwell ceramics department. He began making forms and vessels, but moved away from traditional uses of pottery. He expanded and collapsed the everyday receptacle into a site of suspension. Perhaps he was inspired by Rie's constant pushing of the boundaries of what her materials and skills could manage. Lucie Rie's bowl forms are also delicately poised at that point just before collapse and fired high to hold their position. The aesthetic that Henderson developed was nothing like that of Rie or Cowper. While Rie made smooth, elegantly symmetrical forms, Henderson favoured splintering and disproportion. He used hand building to manipulate clay and experiment with form. He described clay as fluxed earth and saw pottery as a form of abstract sculpture whose material transformation and disintegration he sought to capture and celebrate. He spoke of his work. My present work is obsessed with edges, points of change, endings. It explores the significance of what is broken, torn, or cut. It is a kind of drawing in 3 dimensions. I start with fragments, familiar, found, improvised, and then build up to complex structures. And I think his works speak for themselves. And I've got another couple of makers I want to talk about. Ian Godfrey, who I've really just kind of come to with open eyes and have been beginning to explore. He, like everyone else, was a student at Camberwell, where he met Rie, Cowper, and also Ian Auld. When he graduated, he set up a studio in 1960s London, a metropolis where he could practice as a potter, meet other creative people, express his sexuality as a gay man, and engage in its politics. It was a time when being a potter fitted easily into a counterculture. He was an individual, although never a conventional studio potter. He made thrown forms that would model shapes and then cut into them with a knife when the clay was nearly dry, which sounds really stressful. I don't know nice pictures of his works, but this is one of the examples we've got in the collection. Inspiration came from the pre-dynastic clay and bronze forms in the Mediterranean and from China, cultures where ritualistic and votive objects were accepted and understood. Made for contemplation rather than use, Godfrey's ceramics are non-functional and characteristically whimsical, incorporating working drawers and tiny creatures. Like this bird bath, there's a whole lot of birds inside that you can't really see. Although Godfrey's contribution to ceramics has remained largely unrecognised, his ceramics are significant because they helped to consolidate an increasingly sculptural and progressive approach to clay which was emerging. Ian Godfrey regarded Rie as a spiritual mother and remained in close contact with her throughout his life. He had the rare privilege of being honoured by Lucie Rie with a statement in an exhibition catalogue accompanying a show in 1989 in which Rie described his pots as unique and beautiful. And finally, I'm going to touch on Angus Suttie, who is in this collection, also one of the rare Scottish examples in the collection, but it's a teapot by him. He was born in a small town in Scotland, but he moved to London as quickly as he could, I think. And he was studying under Glenys Barton and Ewan Henderson in Camberwell and shared a studio with Sarah Radstone. He would have met Lucie Rie, but was never officially her student. He moved to London to escape Teeling. He wrote an autobiographical account of growing up in this small parochial town in a gay rights publication called Gay Left. He talked about growing up was painful, and I sometimes felt like a jam pot cover that was being stretched to fit a jam pot that was too big. Suttie, like Godfrey, migrated to London where sexuality was accepted and rights fought for. He embraced the gay subculture of the city, and he said of his own work, I started by wanting to make pots which were a reaction against the white factory-produced earthenware available on the high street. I discovered vessels that were alive, appealing, moving, imaginative, witty, revealing, pleasure in the making. Alison writes of his work, he knew how to play and work. Suttie's work or play suggests he was a rather extraordinary combination, not only of seriousness and amusement, but of traditionalism and rebellion. He wondered whether the new ceramics were not the beginning of a new tradition. His style was something new, whilst also acknowledging that he was very influenced by pre-Columbian arts and craft. This may be true, but there's also a strong narrative of gayness and queerness in the teapots, rings and spoons that he made. Daniel Fountain writes about Suttie's queerness in his essay for the Crafts Council. Many critics have associated Suttie's abstract and geometric twists on tableware to his interest in pre-Columbian architecture and pottery. Yet few have explicitly linked his studio practice with his identity, sexuality, and activism. Many works are provocative, phallic, and exist somewhere in between functional objects and sculpture. Many of Suttie's pieces from the early 1980s are marked by an explosion of colour. They have an undeniable sense of vibrancy, energy, and pride. For Suttie, these ceramics were more than a craft, but a way of life and perhaps an act of protest in itself. In the accompanying catalogue to his 2018 retrospective, Suttie says in his own words, "My work is saying I don't believe in what is happening. The government's stripping everything down to function, but life is richer than that." Angus Suttie's works are about self-expression, about playing with and taking ownership of visual forms, and about increasing visibility of marginalised subcultures and people, albeit in a coded way. The Paisley collection acquired the teapot, made around 1988, typical of his monumental style. built roughly from slabs exploding the domestic familiarity of the teapot. In many ways, it shows a strength and defiance made all the more powerful by the realisation that Angus and Godfrey both died young from HIV-related complications. So in conclusion, the Paisley ceramic collection in particular, its collection of British studio pottery, say from 1958 to 1988, is a time capsule illustrating an historic and rich time for studio ceramics. The works of Rie sit central to this, and her spheres of influence radiate in many directions. Her influence that reached far and deep to so many makers who encountered her at the RCA exhibitions were lucky enough to go for tea. And turning back to those three words, individual, modern, and cosmopolitan, through her rigorous and autonomous approach to style and making, she liberated makers to consider their own work as unique, instinctive, and individual works of art. The makers she inspired felt that their work was relevant to the wider environment that they occupied. Their deconstruction of recognizable domestic forms spoke of the ruptures they were experiencing in the complex changes of life and society that they were living through. References ranging from the kitchen sink to music, geology, mysticism, and activism. Whilst Rie spoke little about the meaning in her work, potteries and ceramic studios sprung up around her in London, Hampstead, Primrose Hill, Brixton, potters making cosmopolitan, sophisticated pots, and inspired words to be written for and about them. In David Attenborough's words, he said, in reflecting on Lucie Rie, a great pot is a series of decisions not to do things. And Kate Malone more recently talking about the mid-century modern exhibition, you can speak and communicate with clay using the vessel as language. So what of current new practice? I think today you can say a lot about the resurgence of interest in ceramics, but there's certainly not the division between what is art and what is craft, what has been made in the town and what has been made in the country. Contemporary postmodern approaches to making allow style, references, and purpose to be picked and mixed, though the success of a pot, in my humble opinion, still relies on due diligence to skills and techniques in the making process. I think we no longer need to pledge allegiance to Rie or Leach, but acknowledge both their outstanding contributions to the continuum that is the pottery tradition. But what is indisputable and sadly missed by the Wedgwood management was that Lucie Rie, a refugee to the UK, was an incredible influence on the spiritual mother of British studio ceramics and liberated a whole generation of makers who had significant stories to tell through the things they made with clay. And I'll end with sort of words by Donna Haraway. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And I've not really even had time to talk about Gillian Lowndes, Carol McNichol, Jacqueline Poncelet, Richard Slee, and Martin Smith, who are all represented in the collection. So I hope you'll make a trip north when we open in 2024. How was that?